What is the most important lesson that you have learnt during the coronavirus lockdown so far? Today is the 50th day of the lockdown in the UK. So it's as good a day as any to just pause for a moment and say, what have we learnt? An unreflected life is not worth living, right? So let's reflect. What's been good about the last 50 days and what's been bad? What do we want to keep? What do we want to lose? What is the most important thing that we have learnt so far in this coronavirus lockdown? Because you see, many of us are realizing that just bunkering down and waiting isn't going to work. This lockdown isn't going to end anytime soon. The COVID transit lounge doesn't exist. It's no good just kind of waiting things out and hoping things will return back to normal. That's not going to happen. We've got to really take stock. And is the next 50 days just set on this remorseless repeat where it's just going to be perpetuating what we've done for the last 50 days, like the same old, or are we going to make some changes? And I'm not talking about external changes. I'm not talking about things like the kids going back to school or being able to see relatives or even going back to work. I'm talking about the internal realities. How are we coping with this? How are we doing? What are our coping strategies to get us through lockdown? What do we want to change? What do we want to keep? And what is the most important thing that we have learned? You see, what crises do is they accentuate fault lines that are already there. That's true in organisations and countries. It's also true in personalities. And if you're anything like me, over the last 50 days, you'll have seen things in your personality as you respond to the pressures of the moment, which you're not that proud about, which you don't like that much, because they highlight those character fault lines that are already there. Maybe as you look back on these last 50 days, you think about the hundreds of hours that you've spent on your phone, the amount of times you've just binged on Netflix, completely consumed with social media. There's a book written recently by a lady who's trying to outsmart the smartphone industry and trying to show people what this perpetual kind of diet of social media does for us. The book title is brilliant. It's called Left to Our Own Devices. And it's an important book simply because of this. What we give our attention to now shapes who we become. How we respond in this crisis shapes our destiny. And the truth is that in our smartphone culture, in our Western world, people are increasingly becoming perpetually distracted and living shallow lives because we're all always distracted by the social media that has gripped our lives. Is that the way we want to live the next 50 days? What is the most important thing that you have learnt over the last 50 days? I'm intrigued by the number 50 because in the Bible, in the Old Testament, 50 was a big deal. Every 50 years, God said to the nation of Israel, I want you to have a year of Jubilee. And the year of Jubilee was three things. It was number one, rest for the land. They had to trust God for food because they weren't going to sow any crops. They were going to rest the land. Then they were going to restore property. If they had purchased property, they were to give it back to the original owner. And thirdly, they were to release all the slaves that they had got. So the year of Jubilee acted like this massive reset button in the life of Israel. Rest, restore, release every 50 years. And it was this fantastic opportunity for the people of God to trust God again for their future, to not see the last 50 years as kind of set in stone for the next 50 years, but to start again. I'd love to think about this coronavirus lockdown as a God-given opportunity to reset, to rest, to be restored, and to be released. What is the single biggest, most important thing that you've learned over the first 50 days of the coronavirus lockdown? Many of us are beginning to learn to pray. We're beginning to learn to pause before God, to rejoice before God, to ask God for things and then yield our will to His. Pray. Pause, rejoice, ask, yield. We're beginning to learn to pray. And the single biggest lesson of the coronavirus lockdown that I believe we all need to learn is that God is only a prayer away. That we can be still and know that He is God. We can be still and have our lives reset by Him. It's an incredible opportunity. Are we going to look back on this coronavirus lockdown and just think about how many Netflix films we watched? Or are we going to look back on this time and say, yeah, no, that's when I got serious with God. That's when He reset my life, where I learned a new rhythm of prayer that dealt with my anxiety, that slowed me down, that stopped me being distracted, and began to shape me to be the kind of person who goes on to shape the world that we go back to. That's my prayer. That's the single biggest, most important thing I believe we can learn from the coronavirus lockdown. Be still and know that Jesus is God. Join me in praying that this next 50 days will be shaped by a deeper, more holding and binding and securing rhythm of life and prayer in God, which shapes the destiny of our lives and shapes the world we go back to. God bless you.